Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor brought America suddenly into World War II. Many men, enraged by the Japanese treachery, jammed into recruiting offices in the days that followed. These ordinary men would become the sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines that would fight overseas and ultimately bring defeat to Germany and Japan. Back on the home front, American women took over the roles that the men had left behind. Collectively, they became known as Rosie the Riveter, and while many women worked in the construction trades, other women performed virtually every job men had previously done. At the same time, the government was encouraging women to join the armed forces. American women had volunteered as nurses since the Revolution, but now each branch of the military created a unique organization for them. 350,000 American women served in uniform during the war. A few brilliant women were carefully selected and recruited for a different type of service. This included some of the most intense, challenging, and secret work done during the war. The job of breaking enemy codes and reading the messages these codes concealed. This is the story of the Code Girls, whose silent and invisible contributions to victory were unmatched in World War II.
The United States utilized the services of women during the war to fill needed positions while the men were overseas. Some were recruited from the elite women's colleges in the Northeast. Some volunteered for the WAC or the Waves, then trained and were put to work in cryptography. Juanita Morris Moody was a native of North Carolina. She volunteered for duty and was sent to Arlington Hall. She caught the attention of her superiors when she broke an extremely difficult German code. Staying on after the war, she later became involved with decoding Cuban messages. Jayne was a California girl, trained as a librarian. Bored, she volunteered for the Waves and was sent to Hunter College in the Bronx for basic training, then assigned to Washington. Librarians were considered a good source for code breaking, given their ability to organize and file disconnected piles of coded messages. Edith Reynolds White was recruited at Vassar by the Navy. She was a highly intelligent young lady who had skipped 2 grades in elementary school and entered Vassar at the age of 16. It seems the Navy preferred to recruit from the prestigious women's schools in the Northeast. Ann Cara Christie was recruited from Russell Sage College in New York. An English major, she brilliantly cracked much of the Japanese code, allowing the U.S. to locate and sink Japanese merchant ships. Ann Cara Christie remained in the field of cryptography and rose to the position of Deputy Director of the National Security Agency. All of the Code Girls were sworn to secrecy. None were aware of the type of work for which they were recruited. A few stayed in the field after the war. Most left the field and never said a word about what they had done until years later, after the history had been declassified.
After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Army and the Navy decided to increase intelligence operations by bringing female college graduates and students to Washington to teach them cryptanalysis, coding, and ciphering. Top students in math, science, and language were recruited from various colleges throughout the country to fill these new positions created within the services. Once these women were settled in Washington, the recruits worked in teams to solve elaborate changing codes the Japanese Navy was using throughout the Pacific. They worked on early versions of computers, built libraries, and translated thousands of documents based on the codes that they were intercepting from the Japanese forces. The work was tedious and frustrating, and the hours were long, often 12 hours a day at least, sometimes 7 days a week, and the time was spent staring at numbers and letters, recognizing ciphers and additives, and attempting to crack these codes in the messages they were receiving, all the while being constantly reminded that they could legally be shot if they discussed their jobs with any civilians outside. The merchant ship water transport codes floating around the Pacific that were used by Japanese to resupply their troops were particularly useful pieces of information that these code girls were able to intercept and translate. Thousands of these messages were intercepted and translated through code research, and even sometimes some lucky guesses. The information obtained from the codes enabled the Navy to pinpoint and sink a large number of Japanese supply ships heading to the Philippines or the South Pacific. This is really important because it kept Japan from procuring a lot of the much needed natural resources and raw materials that it would need to continue to fund its Navy and Army during its war campaign. Before D-Day, the teams of code girls participated in efforts to give Germans false information and flooded the communications waves with fake radio traffic about the site of the Allied landing that was soon to come. They also built and operated bomb machines to decode German Enigma machine messages. This is particularly significant because the Enigma machine was a highly complicated piece of equipment that relied on electric current to process its messages. So the creation of these bomb machines and the implementation of them allowed the code girls and other code breakers to crack into the German code. The women had came to Washington as civilians, but in May of 1942, the Army accepted them into actual military service with the WACS, Women's Auxiliary Corps, and the Navy developed the WAVES program, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. And this allowed the Navy female code breakers to become commissioned officers.
Code Girls' success in the intelligence community played a major role of Allied success in the war. This is displayed in several different ways: using the purple cipher to decode messages, use of information for placement of U.S. war assets, tracking of enemy leaders, and tracking of enemy supply lines. William Friedman referred to the team that broke the code and operations of the purple cipher as the most important source of strategically valuable long-term intelligence available to the Allies as World War II unfolded, including the thinking of the fascist and the collaborating governments all over Europe. As the war unfolded, the Code Girls were continuing to break the Japanese transmissions. The Battle of the Coral Sea is a prime example of their hard work. Their code breaking played a huge role in the placement of the U.S. fleet to intercept the Japanese heading towards New Guinea. Operation Vengeance was an extraordinary moment for the code breakers. They were able to know the exact location of one of Japan's most valuable commanders, Admiral Yamamoto. Through their code breaking, U.S. P-38 fighter planes were able to intercept Yamamoto's flight path and successfully shoot down the aircraft that he was in. At the end of the war, a U.S. naval report found that more than 2/3 of all the Japanese ships, including merchant and warships, were sunk due to the codebreakers' use of the 2468 transport codes.
After the war, the Code Girls were pulled in many directions. The call of society was strong to have the women step aside, let the returning men go back to work. Women were to resume their pre-war homemaker and housewife roles. Many women found themselves in marriages with those they met through the war. Some women suffered depression and a lack of meaning in their lives. Many women ended up in difficult marriages and went from job to job. They went from highly demanding, very important work during the war and were suddenly expected to become domesticated and docile. Some women found support in writing to each other, forming small support groups. This task was made very difficult with the nature of their war work. All the women had worked on highly classified projects and were not allowed to talk about what they had done. Even those women who had married other intelligent officials could not talk about what they had worked on. Often they would tell their friends and families that they were secretaries or paper pushers during the war. Some women decided to remain with the newly forming intelligence agencies that sprung up after the war. Dot Braden, one of the code girls from Arlington Hall, tested well in foreign languages and was allowed to stay on. But she gave it up for her husband and to become a mother. She eventually found work later in life as her children grew, but nothing as demanding as her war years. She remained lifelong friends with another code girl, Crow Weston. Although many of the women were not allowed to speak of what they did, or were even able to tell their families, they stepped up when their country needed them, and they served honorably. The women often look back on their time and effort they put into the war very fondly. As Anne White, one of the women profiled in Code Girls, stated, her wartime code-breaking service was the great moment of her life.